Hello, today we're going to talk about solving quadratics a little bit, and the method we're going to use with that is by taking square roots. So before we get too involved with quadratics, quadratic equations have a variable, and that variable doesn't have an exponent any higher than 2. So see how all of these equations down here contain x squareds? That is what makes them quadratic equations without having any other x to the third or any other higher powers like that. In order to do the solving of the equations today, we'll be actually taking square roots, but it would be helpful to kind of review what a square root is. So this symbol right here that's around the 100 is a square root symbol. And if I'm looking for square root of 100, which is how I'd read that out loud, I'm thinking, what number can I multiply times itself to get me to 100? You might know this off the top of your head, but you can also use Desmos. So if you're going to use Desmos to take square roots, if you look at your Desmos keyboard, you do have a square root button. It's in the bottom row near pi. And then type in your number inside the square root. Desmos tells you that square root of 100 is 10, which makes sense because 10 times 10 is 100. But there's also another number that works for this. If I do negative 10 times negative 10, I also get positive 100. So you get two solutions for this. You get square root of 100 is 10, and square root of 100 is negative 10. So the moral of the story is most of the time when you're taking the square root of a number, you're going to get two solutions. Whatever positive number, which if you'd like to use a calculator Desmos, they'll be able to do that for you. And then the negative version of that number as well. Just to illustrate why both work. 10 times itself, so 10 times 10 is 100. Also negative 10 times itself, negative 10 times negative 10 is also 100. Way of kind of working backwards. There's another way you can write this that you may or may not have seen before. Instead of saying 10 and negative 10, we can also use this plus or minus symbol here. What I have written in orange there, you would read out loud as plus or minus 10, which is a shorthand version for positive 10 and negative 10 both. That is perfectly acceptable. If we were writing things out on paper, I'd be more than happy to see that. But if I have you typing things into Desmos, it's hard to type in that plus or minus symbol. So just list 10 and negative 10 separately in that case. Let's try a few more. So square root of 25, let's use Desmos to check that out. So square root symbol down in your bottom row, 25 is 5. Square root of 25 is 5, but remember there's also another answer. Negative 5 also works. 5 times 5 is 25. Negative 5 times negative 5 is also 25. There's also some special things that can happen. So for this next one, let's try the square root of 0. We're asking, what number do I multiply by itself to get to 0? Desmos tells me 0, which makes sense because 0 times 0 is 0. We only technically get one answer here. It's just 0 because 0 doesn't have a sign. 0 is its own weird little animal. Positive 0, which you never see written, is the same as negative 0, which is just 0. It doesn't make sense to talk about plus or minus 0. So the square root of 0 is just 0. Only one solution there. Let's try one with a negative number. So what happens when we try to take the square root of a negative number? So in Desmos, again, square root symbol, negative 16. If I try to take the square root of a negative number, I get undefined. There is no number that I can multiply by itself and get a negative number. Because remember, to get a negative number by multiplying, I can do, for instance, with 16, I could do 4 times negative 4. But 4 and negative 4 are not both the same number. So since those are not the same number, it is undefined. Anytime you have a negative square root, it is going to be undefined. If you type it into Desmos, Desmos will remind you of that as well. So the main goal for what we're going to do today is to solve these equations like we see at the bottom here. We can solve these equations by taking square roots if we're able to make the equation look like x squared equals number. Sometimes equations will start like that, like this first one, and we can just dive right in. Other times, like the rest of these equations, we'll need to get x squared by itself first. So let's try the first one. I've got x squared equals 36. To get x by itself, I need to undo that squared. The opposite of squaring something is taking the square root. Anything I do to one side, I've got to do to the other. Square root and squared cancel each other out, so I get just x, which is what I'm after. You can do square root of 36 in your head, or you can use Desmos. Square root of 36 is 6, but just like before, That really means 6 and also -6, or plus and minus 6 if you want to be fancy. So our two solutions to that problem are 6 and -6. Like I said, for the rest of these, we need to get x squared by itself first. So undo anything that's not involved with the x squared. So for this next problem, I need to undo that -1 by adding 1 to both sides. When I do that, this side is now just x squared. 80 plus 1 is 81. Now I go ahead and take the square root of both sides to undo that squared on x. And if you know this, great. If not, you can use your calculator. Square root of 81 is 9. And so that means our two solutions for x are +9 and -9. Rest of these, same idea, just a little more complicated because we've got a little bit more going on in our equation. Solve this to start with like you would any other equation, like you would if this was just a regular x instead of an x squared. So generally speaking, we undo addition and subtraction first. I'm going to undo -7 by adding 7. 57 plus 7 is 64. Now I'm going to divide to undo the number in front of x squared. 64 divided by 4 is 16. I'm almost done. The last thing I need to do is take the square root of both sides. Square root of x squared is just x. Square root of 16, you might know that off the top of your head. If not, use Desmos, no shame there. We get 4. And so really x equals +4 and -4. Next up, same idea. Undo the +3 by subtracting 3. Then divide by the number in front of x squared. This time it's 64. 64 divided by 64 is 1. And then last but not least, take the square root on both sides. Square root of x squared is just x. Square root of 1 is 1, but let's double check it with Desmos just for the practice of using Desmos, is 1. But remember, it's not just 1, it is +1 and -1 for our two solutions here. Next up, undo -8 by adding 8 to both sides. -47 plus 8 is -39. Now divide by the number in front of x squared. We get x squared equals -13 when we do that. To finish it off, I need to take the square root of both sides. Square root of x squared is just x because square root and square root are opposites. Let's check out what happens when we do square root of -13. So square root -13 is undefined. Remember, anytime we have a negative number under the square root, it's going to be undefined. So this one, we aren't able to get numbers for x. We just say it's undefined. Last but not least, undo this +3 by subtracting 3 from both sides. I did not mean to write that 3 there. 1 second. So we get 2x squared equals 3 minus 3 is just a 0. It's okay to get a 0 there. Now divide by the number in front of x squared. 0 divided by 2 is also 0. Again, perfectly fine. And then last but not least, square root of both sides. This side just becomes x. And then looking back here, the square root of 0 is just 0. You could check that in Desmos if you wanted to. We actually already did it earlier. Square root of 0 is just 0. No +0 and -0, just 0. So hopefully now you're starting to feel a little comfortable with solving quadratics by using square roots and the whole process of taking square roots. I hope you have a wonderful day.